Hello and welcome back to the Renewables Podcast. We are here again with another exciting episode. But before we get into it all, how are you, Sam?
I'm very good. Yeah, very good. I've had a big journey to get here today, but excited to get into this chat. This is this is really my wheelhouse from being in solar for a while. So I'm excited to get into it. But yeah, I'm all good, feeling good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's been another day in paradise in the solar world, and Sam's come armed with his regulation book, so I'm expecting a grilling. But before we dive into the intricacies of this conversation, it's quite fitting with the Proteus products that we've got out on the table there. When we're talking about design, one of the big key buzzwords at the minute is bi-directional protective devices, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Amendment 3 came out, and that's obviously ensuring that we are checking these devices. But some of these devices have been bi-directional just by nature for a long time. And one of those is this one here. This is the Proteus RCBO that is bi-directional by design.
Yeah, by luck as well, more than good judgment. I remember speaking to Kieran about this way back when no one really thought it was a thing. And, you know, that foresight that he had designing this, as he now says, back then, paid off dividends.
Yeah.
Because it's the go-to product, I think, for most renewables installers. And when you see the Type B single module RCBO that they're just bringing out in the world of EVs and solar as well, you know, we've got all the options to just drop these into existing consumer units. So it's solving problems rather than creating them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more companies like Proteus try and innovate around like the Type B RCBOs and the bidirectional stuff, it drives that conversation in the industry and pushes others to do the same. Because, you know, not everyone has a Proteus DB, but through the visit that we had all that time ago, I could see quite clearly that Proteus are thinking about all this stuff really early on, which was one of the most impressive things that I found at that trip.
Yeah, and it's good that they're choosing to back us with this podcast as well, and we're excited to have that support. And we hope you guys and girls are appreciating our efforts in promoting this brand in a fair way, because you know we have raised issue in some of the episodes around switchgear in certain locations, and there is those conversations to be had. So we're not excluding that just because we are supported by a particular brand, and they're down for those conversations as well. So it's really interesting, I think. The wider design discussion outside of the protective equipment at an AC level is super interesting. And that's where we're going to focus in on with this one, Sam, isn't it? I think we're going to look at the roof aspect and some of the DC side of things.
Yeah, I think we're wanting to kind of unmuddy the waters, if that's the right way to say it, because you look at a panel data sheet and there's so many facts and figures and numbers and descriptions and warranties and everything in there that it's very difficult for people that are just entering the industry, people that have been in the industry a while, and especially if you're not doing this stuff every single day, it's hard to always know exactly what you're looking at. So we want to just run through some of the basic things to look at when designing a solar PV system, focusing a bit more on the DC side, the roofing side, and all of that, I think, for this podcast. But as ever, we'll see what rabbit holes we go down.
I'm sure there'll be one or two with looking at the pile of books you've got under your feet there.
I've come prepared.
So, I mean, in my limited experience, I'm happy to say that I've made mistakes with design on solar systems. Not to the point that there was any structural damage or any risk of something catching fire, but certainly with the components I'm selecting and them working, and in particular to do with the voltages and the currents within the strings that I was designing. I think it was the second job in where I'd selected an 8 kilowatt SolarX or SolX inverter that had 3 inputs on it. And I assumed naively that meant 3 MPPTs, but that wasn't the case. Have you had any examples where you've maybe been caught out?
I was trying to think back. I mean, I think this is a really good starting point to start this conversation is at the inverter, because the first thing to look at with the solar PV system is, yes, how many panels can we physically squeeze on that roof with respect to the margins and everything else that we need to have there, but also will that number of panels work with that inverter? So that I'm excited to sort of work from the inverter backwards on this one. But to answer your question about have we made any mistakes like that, I think there will have been things that have happened, but nothing. We had kind of a bit of a soft, I wouldn't say entry because I've been in the industry a while, but a soft entry with Oval into solar PV design, because most of our kit up until probably about a year ago has mainly been Solar Edge. And we'll probably go into this further on into the podcast, but most of one of the big benefits of Solar Edge is it's very, very flexible. So string voltages, you have to consider, but it's more about the number of optimizers that you're fitting. Does the optimizer match the panel? And the optimizer basically then takes care of the string voltage. So with a Solar Edge system, usually the domestic string voltage is around 350 volts. So that, like on the big commercial one that commercial for a care home that we've just done, 38 Viridian in-roof panels, that was all on one string. It was Solar Edge, and the string voltage of that, because it's got optimizers, I think drops to about 750 volts. But you've got 38 times the open circuit voltage on those Viridians is about 42 volts. So it allows you to do very long, big strings and not worry too much about the calculations because the optimizers work all that out.
It's clever.
Yeah, it is. And the good thing is that if Viridian ever change the panel, and there might be a 420 watt that you have to change, one of these 405s that we fitted, as long as that panel works with that optimizer, you can plug that bigger wattage panel that they'll have a different string voltage, different short circuit currents, all the rest of it, and the optimizer will basically smooth all that out to make sure it works within that 750 volt string voltage. So that has meant that we could be quite lazy with some of those. I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's meant that if a customer wants to go for Solar Edge, it's been quite easy to design the system. It's more about how many panels we can fit on the roof and which optimizer suits it more than actually getting into the weeds of the temperature coefficients and all this other stuff. But we're starting to see, as more customers now want to look at slightly cheaper options than Solar Edge, we're now having to kind of re-look at and reacquaint ourselves with some of these calculations, which is why this is a really good topic and one I'm excited to dive into, really. But to ask you a question then, so to drill down into that issue you had on site, you mentioned you had this inverter that had 3 inputs, but your mistake was that you thought they were 3 MPPTs or maximum power point trackers, but in fact it wasn't 3 MPPTs, it was 3 inputs.
Yeah. So it was 2 MPPTs, and one of them was shared across 2 of the inputs. And at that stage, I didn't realise that was a thing. You just see the inputs and think, well, that's an input for a string. But when you start looking at the data sheet and actually pay attention to what's in front of you, you can see that there's something else at play there. And it's essentially paralleling up the strings on those 2 inputs on the 1 MPPT. Right. And when you parallel the strings, we'll get into later in the conversation, you kind of double the current. And that caused us a problem. Right. Because we ended up over peaking it. But it didn't present straight away, funnily enough. I think we installed it in January. Obviously, the weather plays in your favour at that stage because nothing's really working to its limit. The currents are generally lower anyway. And the system worked fine. It was only when it got towards March time, I think, when you've got that cooler but brighter weather, that we started to see those currents peak beyond the rating of that inverter. And it didn't just shut down that one string either, it shut the entire inverter down in full, so it lost all generation. And of course, your phone starts ringing at that stage. So this is an install we left in the wild. I'm happy to admit to that. The customer was very understanding. They knew we were new to all of this and still feeling our way around some of the technologies. And you just think that you should know these things. We was quite embarrassed at the time. I remember thinking, oh God, this is horrendous. Like, how could we make a mistake like that? But speaking to other contractors, Mike from East Renewables, he's done something similar, I think, with voltages rather than currents in his case. So I'm more reassured now that it's one of those things that just can happen. And we just swapped to an inverter with 3 MPPT inputs, and the problem was solved.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's quite a common thing because solar, without trying to moan about to people entering this industry, because it's just a learning process that people go through. I think people see solar as quite plug and play, and you just kind of, bang those 10 panels together and just sling them into that inverter, that's fine. And for most of the time, you can probably get away with hardly doing any design on it because the inverters nowadays have a really good voltage range that they can work around. But the data sheets for solar inverters and for solar panels can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. So when you found that, when you saw that issue, was it looking through the data sheet that then kind of alerted you to that? And how was that data sheet kind of laid out? Can you remember?
I mean, looking back at that time, I was looking at the voltage of the panel and the current of the panel, and then comparing that to what I thought was the MPPT input range. I think it's 580 volts on that inverter as your kind of maximum voltage it will accept, and 12 amps. And we was under that with the panels that we'd selected. But obviously, when you parallel those up, that current figure jumped beyond that rating for the size of the array we were using, and it didn't like it. So that's how we got caught. But yeah, it's just reviewing the data sheets and then understanding the panel that you'd put on that system was never going to work because of the layout you'd chosen. And I guess that's the difference with Solar Edge. You're saying it drops that voltage down. I know with the systems we use the Tigo or Tigo, however you pronounce it, optimizers, and they don't do that. They do just sum the string up still.
Right.
You get the safety benefits that Solar Edge delivers, so you're still getting all of the arc detection and the temperature sensing and stuff, but it's not reducing that voltage in the string. So that's still there. It doesn't drop it to 1 volts either when it's not generating. It's still present as the full voltage rating. So yeah, there's some subtle differences there. It's interesting, the Solar Edge technology. But that's not something we've gone down. Our customers all come to us generally for Give Energy products, and they don't integrate with the Solar Edge optimizers as far as I'm aware. They need to go on the Solar Edge inverter. So it's something we can't currently use, but that's actually quite interesting, I think. Something we're going to look into and see how that works, just on a learning exercise for myself more than anything else. But yeah, it did catch us out, and it is just that paralleling up of a string, essentially. Lots of commercial systems do that as standard out in the field anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's probably a podcast in a comparison between Solar Edge, Tigo, and a standard string inverter, and kind of drilling into that. So that's probably one for us to mark on our on our to-do list. But yeah, the whole inverter sizing to panel compatibility is an interesting one. So on that data sheet then, it'll probably have said, so you had 2 MPPTs, one of the MPPTs had 2 inputs, which if you use both those inputs, they'll parallel those 2 strings up onto that one MPPT, or tracker, to save me kind of shouting MPPT all day. And then the other one just had 1 input that didn't obviously parallel anything.
Yeah,
that's interesting. So yes, on the data sheet then, it'll probably have gone, what did it say, like 1/2, 1/1.
I think it was 12/20 or something. It didn't double the current for the 2 paralleled arrays, which I assume is due to the rating of the components inside the inverter rather than what it could do. And I'd naively assumed that meant you can either use 12 amps on the first MPPT, but then it kind of summed 24 across the last 2. I can't remember what I actually thought when I read it, but it didn't make sense in reading it. It's just takes 12 amps. And I thought that's what I was putting into each MPPT when really it wasn't. I think the string current was around 9.99 on those panels, so we were well under that. You don't think there's going to be an issue. It turns out there is when you don't fully understand the data sheets. I think that was a big learning experience that I've gone on now. We're 2 years in now, so it seems old hat even for a relative newbie like me. But back then, you're like, Jesus, why can't they just write on it what it actually does in plain English rather than slashes here? And there's the other learning thing with your inverters, that you actually want them running quite close to their limits, so that they're efficient when they're actually working. So you've got this mindset of trying to keep within the voltage limits of what your strings can do and the currents, but also wanting them to be working quite hard. And those two things, it's like a fine divide, isn't it, to get through that little slot.
Yeah, for example, that care home project that I was talking about, where we had the 38 panels all in one string, that was working on a 10 kilowatt Solar Edge inverter 3-phase, and it's about 15 kilowatt peak of panels. Now, one of the reasons that we did a 10 kilowatt inverter was the G98 aspect of it, but the other reason was that when we increased that inverter to I forget exactly what the next, I think it's 12 kilowatt inverter, the annual yield calculation went down, only by a couple of hundred kilowatt hours a year. But because the inverter wasn't running as hard and wasn't as efficient, it dropped the yield down to like a couple of hundred kilowatt hours a year less than if it was working harder on a 10 kilowatt. So there's lots of considerations with that, and like I say, the solar edge side is a bit more lazy, but it has its benefits.
Do you think with that, like historically, I'm just thinking as an electrician here, you get something that, you know, you're getting 15 kilowatts of input in. The logical mindset of an electrician, I'd think, would say, right, I want a 20 kilowatt inverter. So we've got a buffer in it on that side, when really it's the opposite, isn't it? So it's a totally different change of thought. So I'm justifying my own thinking there as an electrician coming into industry that you would make those design choices without that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, we're used to sizing switchgear. You know, if we've got, you know, a 20 amp, you know, a machine or a whatever, you might not select a 20 amp isolator. You might jump to a 32 just to give yourself that bit of headroom, and you know, just you think, well, the components in this are probably a bit more juicy to actually, you know, switch this off under load. We don't necessarily want it to be at 20 amps, but then inverters, you know, they want to be running pretty hard. But yeah, it's an interesting mind shift from trying to give yourself that headroom to, you know, to actually trying to get things at maximum as best you can. But a similar thing to what you've just been saying, Mark, about the Solax inverter that had the three inputs, two trackers. We've been looking at the Tesla Powerwall 3 recently, and that has 3 MPPTs, 3 trackers, and 6 inputs. So our designer had an initial glance over it and said, "Oh, this has got 6 MPPTs." I went, "There is no way anyone in the UK is bringing out a domestic inverter that's got 6 MPPTs." So we had a little look into it, and it's because each MPPT tracker has 2 inputs. So those, because Tesla, claim that their inverter can run at probably about 20 kilowatts of solar PV, which is fantastic for for a system in the UK that's single phase. And when we had a look at it, it was 2 inputs per tracker, but it means that anything that if we use both those inputs, we are doubling potentially the ampage, but the voltage is staying the same. And so you look deeper into that data sheet, and their maximum short circuit current per string, this is all from memory, so the figures might be a little bit off. The maximum short circuit current per tracker, is 30 amps. So when you look at a data sheet like what we've got here, these are the Trina panels. We're not sponsored by Trina, it's just one we had to hand. We can see that the short circuit current for the 435 watt Trinas is 10.64. So we're going to go into the different ampage readings here, but if we compare that to the figures I've just given you, we've got 30 amps maximum on the Tesla, and these panels here, if we had 2 strings connected to one tracker, we would be at 21.8 or something like that, 21.28 or something like that. So we'd be under that. But if we tried to have a massive string of panels all connected in series, our string voltage, our VOC, would be wildly over what the Tesla can handle, because the open circuit voltage on these is 51.8. So it's not going to take us long to hit that. 10 panels gets you 518 volts, which is probably about the maximum that the Tesla can handle. In
paralleling up 2 strings of 10, though, you could get 20. That voltage would still stay around the 500 volts, and then you'd double that current, wouldn't you? So you can still maybe get, that's the adjustment that it gives you in paralleling strings up. So your current will double, but your voltage across the 2 that are coming together would stay the same.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting way of doing it. And the DMEGs here, I've got a data sheet on them just to compare. These have an ISC of 14.4 amps.
14.4.
So by the time you've doubled that and you're kind of at 28, and then you're looking at some of the coefficients and calculations that need to be done, you might be over peaking that power wall with a parallel couple of strings from these DMEGs. So it is important to reference. I think we've got 2 extremes of panels here. I've deliberately produced these, and the Trinas do have high voltages. 52 volts a panel is way up there, isn't it? And these DMEGs at around 14.4 are quite high, a domestic grade panel as well. But the voltage is dropped off accordingly. These are like 32 volts.
Yeah, so you've got a 32 volt panel, but a 14 amp short circuit, and I've got a 51, nearly 52 volt open circuit voltage and a 10.64 current. So if you're always using DMEGs, but you have then an installation where they want a lot of panels on a ground mount and they want a Tesla, you might have to go, you know what, I can't use all those pallets of DMEGs I've got in my unit because I need something that's got a lower short circuit current so I can parallel this up into this one tracker. Mark, you're making me so nervous about some of these installs that we've done.
I mean,
now.
the other argument to that is that you maybe wouldn't need to parallel your string because you've only got 32 volts. You can just series them up to reach maybe 500 volts or so, and you might not be that many different in terms of your panel. And these output at 450, I think those ones are 435. So, you know, it's the power rating as well, isn't it? There's so much in there. I think that's one of those where the blanket approach sometimes, and I've been guilty of this, is you get a roof space and you think, right, what's the biggest panel I can get at the minute? 450 watts, for want of a better example. How many of those fit? When really, if you actually looked at the roof space and some of the panel characteristics, you might end up being down at a 420 watt panel that could be a little bit smaller. You could fit more of them on there. They may have different outputs that you can string up better. Maybe swap into solar edge. You could actually get more out of the roof space in terms of generation than just default into that biggest panel you can find and getting as many on there as you can.
Yeah, it does just show you that you can't just have one system that fits all applications, and there's a lot to consider when you're looking at these systems, and this is what some installers don't realise, and when you're up against other companies quoting for jobs, you might have spent a whole evening or a whole afternoon trying to search for that, and you're up against a company that just always fits this system, always just bangs that in, and that's, you know, it'll work for 10 months of the year, and then the two colder, sunnier months, it keeps falling out. But then they mess about with it for a bit, and then suddenly the time ticks on, and it's all right for a bit. So it is important to look at all of this stuff. But one thing there as well is a lot of these, when you have a look at these inverter data sheets, certainly for like hybrid battery storage systems, they have a recommended power output. Now, it's recommended because we've obviously got these calculations that we can do within the actual calculations to effectively see if the string that you're proposing works with that inverter. So you might find that the power is slightly more than that, but you've got your calculations here to back up the fact that that'll be okay because it can handle a string current, a string voltage of, 600 volts, and it can handle a short circuit current of whatever amps. So, the power isn't actually as important as getting these bits nailed because, we've got Ohm's law.
Absolutely. And a lot of the hybrid inverters have that ability to send some of the extra PV generation direct to the batteries that are separate to their own rated output. So there's flexibility in there with a hybrid system that you don't necessarily get with an AC coupled and string inverter setup. But I think we just draw back a little bit to what you've been saying about temperatures and how that can affect it. A lot of these figures are all based on STC, and there's a lot of electricians who may be listening to this wanting to get into solar or just starting as I once did. I didn't know what STC meant when I first started looking at this. So, what is that, Sam?
Yeah, standard test conditions. So it's one of those things, it's like it's an industry standard that when you pick up a data sheet like this, or you look on, Waxman's website, to give them a little plug for coming on, you can see a 435 watt, a 450 watt, a 300 watt, and you know that they're comparable, having been tested to the same conditions that all the rest of them have. So you often see on data sheets, it's probably some law that they have to show the standard test conditions data, but a lot of panel data sheets have actually started to have some other information there as well. So you've got like reference to 10% irradiance ratio. There's other things that they've done to test it to provide you more information, but the standard test conditions is 1,000 watts per meter squared of light hitting that panel, a temperature of 25 degrees, and I think at an angle of 30 degrees, something like that. So that looking at all those panels across the full range, that you're not having someone that's tested it to 2,000 watts of light hitting that per meter squared to give you this huge output of energy. You know that they've all been tested to the same level, which is quite good.
Yeah, I mean that's where it can catch you out if you design to that STC value and think I've got 580 volts, I'm going to get to 570 based on STC. When you then factor in some of the seasonal variation and you start doing your temperature coefficients, I think it's called NOT, it's on here as NMOT, I think it's termed different between different brands, that can adjust those voltages quite substantially. I was surprised to see it. I think typically I'm looking at a 12 panel string of lots of what we install is about the limit of what we can do as a rough rule of thumb. If you take that to 13 panels, then at times, and it's very rare times, you'd have to have a temperature down sort of around freezing and a bright sunny day, but it can happen in April, it can happen in October, where you might see those voltages peak into the 600s, and all of a sudden your inverter's shutting down. And the same thing happens with the current at that stage as well, because if the voltage rises, so does the current. Ohm's law, as you've referenced already, Sam, I think. And that's the thing that can trip people up, because you can make the best effort with your design and slip up with that. And to be fair, a lot of the calculators that are out there, Easy PV as an example, does display that. It does show you it, but it's not bulletproof. There are still times when that's not entirely accurate. If you've measured your roof pitch slightly out, for example, or your postcode, it might be a new build and your postcode's not fully accurate or whatever. You know, those things can trip you up. So it's something to be aware of. And it's the same with your testing at the end as well. I've made some videos today for TIS actually about inputting the values to when you're doing your performance tests. If you get those wrong off the data sheets, then that will give you a fail on your installation. And it's so easy to do because the instrument will be asking for alpha, beta, and gamma, but on your data sheets, it's referenced as temperature coefficients. So you've got your coefficient to do with Pmax, VOC, and ISC. And I can't remember what the order are off the top of my head, but they're alpha, beta, and gamma, essentially. Get them in the wrong order, miss the minus off and put them as positives, all your results go out the window, and it's the same at the design stage. So it sounds easy when you're kind of getting into solar, because it's plug and play. But when you drill into it, setting your strings out, you know, you could be out doing this as I was in January, and you might not be as lucky as me where it was just a change of an inverter. You've been up on the roof, you paid for all your scaffolding, you've set up a string of 14 panels, and come March, it stops working. You've got to get the scaffolders back out, you've got to take another pair of string wires up there to put an extra string in. The conversation with the customer doing that and the cost of doing it, it gets expensive and embarrassing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at that NOCT there, irradiance of 800 watts per meter squared. So they've dropped it from 1,000, ambient temperature of 20 degrees, and a wind speed of 1 meters per second. So there's different ways that they kind of give you as much information as possible there. And like you say, there's the temperature ratings and what have you. And on the temperature side of things, you referenced the regs, and I didn't want you to call me out on it, to be honest, because now everyone's going to think I'm going to have all the answers here.
It's regulations corner with Sam.
I hope not. So if I just lift the Bible up here, we've got in here, I read a little section here in the special in section 7. So it says without information of the expected minimum temperature of the site, or without information about the temperature coefficient of the PV module. So if you didn't have like this data, UOC, so basically the voltage open circuit max shall be chosen equal to 1.2. So basically you have to times it by a multiple of 1.2, and that is for that what you're just talking about there, Mark, which is the temperature fluctuation on that panel. So yeah, I think we're going to stick to installing Solar Edge, Mark.
It's a lot
There's
easier,
a lot, isn't there?
It's a lot easier. It's a mind melt. And I think using your calculators, there's Open Solar as well. I think Waxman have got something coming out if it's not out already, which can really help you. Don't take it as granted, but if you're in kind of the safe window of what you consider acceptable tolerance yourself, it's kind of safe. We have a a rough rule that if we're going over 12 panels, we need to start thinking about it. And those Trinas actually last week caught us out on that, because that was 12 panels and they're 52 volts. And we've been using Jinkos for ages, and they're like, I think they're 41 volts. So they would have been fine with a 12 panel string. But 12 of those clearly over 600 volts, and that was going to overpeak our inverter. And it was only when we'd laid the first 6 down did I think, hang on a minute. That was the stage we realised. It's the one I've just dropped on YouTube, actually. So it was very easy to pull another string up and solve that problem at that stage. It would have presented straight away because it was nice and sunny, but it just shows you can still get caught out while you're out doing these things.
Yeah, I think bringing it back to the real world, I think there are things that you can do as an installer if you do have a standard set of or a standard brand and a standard panel that you use. We use a lot of the Perlite 435 watt panels, so we've kind of made like a bit of I wouldn't say a cheat sheet, but we've kind of made, look, on this inverter, this is the maximum we can use that we feel safe to use, considering all this information. So it's not that necessarily you have to do this exact calculation every single time, but you can kind of look into this and go, okay, right, we're going to start using a new panel. Let's interrogate all of this now. Have a look at the, for us, we're using a lot of the Mind Libby kit at the minute, but we also use Alpha, and the Solar Edge is in a different sort of ballpark with the optimizers. But any of the standard string inverter style systems, we need to be looking at this and actually creating like a bit of a grid to go, well, this system, if we're going to pair this panel with this system, this is the maximum we can do on that string. Has it got any parallel options? And all these different things that I think sometimes when you're just slapping panels down, you can forget that there are these in-depth calculations that do need to be made, because all the information's there. It's just the fact that you don't look at them. Because there's also here that you've got power tolerance of like 0 to 5 plus 5. I don't know if that's percent or that must be watts.
It is percent, I think.
Yeah.
Some of them are different. These are 3%. And again, that's the learning journey of setting the test instruments where I've gone into all of that, because that was asking for tolerance percentage figures, and I'm like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
And you start mind hiving like through data sheets, and then you see these things cropping up.
Yeah, that's it. So even looking at this here, the measuring tolerances to the standard test conditions, there is 3%. So it's not a huge amount, but it'll mean that you can't take this information as absolutely bang on. You're not going to plug that panel in, even in those exact conditions. If you were lucky enough to put it in those conditions, you still might not get that 43. Where is it? The VOC 51.8. It might be slightly higher, slightly lower. It's going to be in and around that. But
I mean, it's not a fine science, is it? These panels come out of factories. They may be ever so slightly different. The glass might not be totally perfect on one to the other, so there will be that tolerance and that spread. And in fairness, I'm just going to reference back to my last experience the other week. We'd specified Jinkos on that job, but the wholesaler couldn't get them.
Right.
So they'd swapped to Trina. This is common occurrence from speaking to other people who've been in solar through COVID and through the supply issues, where your panels would swap. I had made the very quick change on the kind of design side for the MCS aspect to make sure that was all taken care of, but I hadn't rerun the numbers, and that's where I got caught out. So I would say to anyone who is fresh to it and hasn't had the scars of having their panels swapped or inverters or whatever, if that does happen, make sure you run the maths again before you stood on the scaffold with 6 panels laid down, because that wasn't ideal, but we did get away with
it. That's it. That's all that matters. No, but like you say, on a serious note, it's good that was seen at that point, because, like you say, it'd be such a nightmare, and it'd be a tricky one, because as soon as you've got those installed, if the customer said, "Oh, the system keeps tripping out," your brain would instantly go, "Well, it's been working for 10 months. Why is it now not working?" You'd go out and you'd probably think, is it the inverter that's faulty? And if the system that you're using doesn't have a good error log, then you'd be lucky to get there exactly when that issue is happening, because it could vary day to day. If you have, like you say, if you have a cold, sunny day and you go there on a warm, sunny day, it can be not doing it. So this is why, and I think it would take you quite a while, really, to get to this point where you went, well, actually, let's just drill into this and make sure that it isn't, You know, it isn't a problem with the actual initial design, because you kind of wrongly assume that that's all been done properly, don't you? Really?
Blame the manufacturer. That's what everyone default does. If something's gone wrong, it's the inverter or it's the panel. It's nothing that we've ever done, obviously, but you know, sometimes that happens. We make mistakes, and you know, you've got to verify these things. Fortunately, with the example we had with that Solax inverter, it did have a good error log. It was all in there. We could see what had been happening, and very quickly understood that we'd messed up. But like you say, that might not be the case, certainly from brand to brand. Our older systems that are out there, you might not be going to one of your jobs that you're fault finding on. It could be something that's got no monitoring on, that's been in someone's loft for 5-10 years, and they never realised it had stopped working because they've got no app to look at it.
Yeah.
And you know, you go in there because they've been up, I don't know, doing something in the loft and noticed their inverter was shut down. So you're kind of trying to work your way back from that. So it's not always your system and your fault when you are looking at this.
Yeah.
I think before we move on with the conversation, we should maybe talk about what actually VOC and ISC and all those things are on those data sheets. You know, there are probably lots of seasoned installers listening to this, but the normal electricians who were just like me a couple of years ago who haven't got a Scooby.
Yeah. Just before, there was one last point on that last bit I was going to make, was swapping inverters out as well. So if you're swapping the inverter out and you run the standard numbers, you need to be looking at that parallel strings, how many inputs, how many trackers it's got, and making sure your new inverter does work with those panels. And you know, there's a second opportunity there to redo the numbers. So that's always important. It's not just a case of buying another 3.6 kilowatt inverter. It's, you know, is it a Sunny Boy that's operating at 600 volts or 700 volts string voltage?
Sunny Boys are wild, aren't they? I'd seen that. I was like, wow. I was like, what's going on?
So they're mainly designed, I think, really for allowing you to just run one string and have a big one, you know, set of panels on one roof, one string, and what have you. But yeah, you've got some serious voltage flying around there. But just wanted to interject that before we move on to
It's a good point.
running through this. So yeah, sorry, Mike, you were saying.
So the VOC, we'll start with the voltage side of things. So VOC is your kind of peak voltage, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is not under load. Like I say, we're looking at the standard test conditions, so 1,000 watts per meter squared, cell temperature of 25 degrees. You know, this is what this panel, if we're looking at a 435 on my sheet here for the Trinas, we're looking at a VOC, voltage open circuit, of 51.8 volts, and I think yours was in the 30s, was it?
Yeah, it's VOC is 34.8.
And what wattage of panel is that?
That's 450.
450, yeah. So mine for a 435 is 51.8, and yours for a 450 is
34.4.
34.4. So it can vary massively. So yeah, that's not under load. That is just at you know, if you got the MC4s in your hand and you put a tester on, under those conditions, you would get that roughly, that 51.8 on my sheet.
Yeah, and then that shows like big, clear example of the differences that you can have. And the other one is your VMP, which I think is voltage...
Maximum power point.
That's it. It actually says it on here. So
yeah.
So that's when it's working, is it? When it's generating?
Exactly. So for mine, if we compare mine, I've got 51.8 of VOC, voltage open circuit, and that drops to 43.6 when the system is working. So under load, effectively at 435 watts, it would drop to 43.6. So
it's quite a shift, and these ones go from 34-ish down to 29. So there's another shift in the downward direction there. So some volts dropping out as the system's generating.
Yeah,
which is interesting. But that's the two differences, isn't it? Again, we'll reference back to why that's important once we've gone through ISC and IMP, because there is a reason why you need to know the difference on these. So your ISC is...
Yeah, so it's your current short circuit. So basically, if you're plugging that positive and negative MC4 connector on the back of the panel together, so creating a short circuit, on my panel, a Trina 435, we've got 10.64 amps.
And these are 14.4, so we've got the lower voltage but the higher current. So that's quite a reasonable current to have there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the IMP, which is, again, the current when it's working.
Yeah, current maximum power point. So mine goes from 10.64 short circuit to 9.99.
So not that much of a shift there, is there?
No.
These are going from 14.4 to 13.8.
Yeah.
So it's a little drop off. in the current, but it is a little bit lower when it's running as to when it's just there sat doing now.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see there that, and this is standard with most data sheets, you've got effectively a voltage reading when the panel is just stood on its own, nothing plugged into it. You've got a voltage reading when it's working. You've then got a current reading when you short it out, and then you've got a current reading when it's working. And that's basically what those are. So don't be kind of terrified when you look at all these VOC, ISC, the one that always used to scare me as an apprentice was VMPP. You're like, oh my God, what's this? But as soon as you get your head into it, you can kind of work those through. So hopefully that's helped anyone that might be fitting solar but just never really looks at this because their boss is always doing it or supposedly always doing it.
It's important, as we've discussed, due to the inverters, but the isolation as well. You made this point before we started chatting, Sam, that's the figure that can really set out what switchgear we're putting into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So switchgear, cabling, and we'll touch on cabling in a minute, but all of the devices that are there to deliver the power, protect you, and all the rest of it need to be able to withstand that short circuit current. Because obviously, when we do our solar PV testing on a string system, again, it's a bit different with Solar Edge because you've got the optimizers. But when we're doing a standard set of testing with standard string inverters, one of the tests there is the short circuit current to verify what you're actually getting at the irradiance that you're measuring at the time, and that is then used to make sure your cabling is big enough and your isolators are big enough, and also that it's not going to blow your inverter off the wall, because you make sure your inverter can handle that amount of short circuit current as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your standard test conditions on that one, where we've got 14.4, I think it was, amps, you might have a time where you could maybe see 15, 16 amps. And we use IMO isolators for our DC strings, and I think they're rated at 800 volts. So the voltage side of things, you're well covered. But if you're at the 16 amp range, you might want to bump it up to 25 if you're using a particular panel to another, or if you're isolating a paralleled string through one isolator. You've got those factors you need to think about, that it can break the current and withstand the voltages that are running through it. And it's the same for your MC4 connectors as well. And if you're using fusing for them, they're not all rated the same. So that's something to look at. If you're doing your Y branching as well with your MC4s, they are all subtly different in their ratings between brands. So there's that, and then the cabling itself, and it all plays a part in normal electrical design, I would say. So the inverters can get a bit confusing for electricians coming into solar, because there is that different shift in wanting things to be working harder than we maybe otherwise would usually design with an electric shower or whatever. But in terms of the cabling and the isolators, very much the same. You need to factor off that worst case scenario of current and voltage that could be present, and make sure that it can make and break it quite safely.
Yeah, and just to touch on the isolators before we move on to the cable side, we use some Kraus and Nehmer isolators, and they have on the box, they come at 920 volts, 11 amps. But when you slide down that voltage scale, the ampage rating increases.
Oh, interesting.
So and that has got to be due to the arc that is created within the isolator, because if we're disconnecting a DC, disconnecting a DC circuit, which is effectively what an array is, the higher the voltage, the bigger that arc is going to be. So the stress on those contacts is going to be greater. So I think around, don't quote me, I think around 500 volts, I think it drops to the current rating increases to 20 odd amps, something like that. Yeah. So for the majority of our systems, these isolators are more than adequate. But I think sometimes people get too fixated on, because we're used to it, looking at AC isolators, we're looking at a voltage, which 230 or 400 volts usually, and then the current rating that can handle. And we don't have the fluctuations in the voltage really for most cases on the AC side. So we're used to just seeing voltage, current. But on DC, we have got that. You can have the same inverter, same panels, but just through the fact of you paralleling that string up, and like you mentioned, Matt, feeding that through one isolator using a Y branch on the roof, so that your voltage is staying the same, but you've doubled your ampage, and you always just bang these isolators in. It's looking at that and going, well, we can't use these isolators. The voltage is the same, but our current has doubled because we've paralleled that up on the roof. So yeah, that's it's an interesting one really, and obviously if you're finding that, let's take the example just whilst we're on that theme of paralleling. If you have an issue on the roof where you have exceeded your voltage on the roof, rather than running another set of strings in, if your inverter happens to have a decent current tolerance, it might be a case that actually you can make some adjustments to parallel, you still have to get onto the roof, but to parallel that one string up and feed it down so that string voltage decreases, because you've maybe got, rather than having 20 panels in one string, you've now got 10, but there's a secondary string on the roof that then is paralleled together with that one set of cabling that goes down. So you've actually got two arrays of 10 panels. You've halved the voltage, but you've doubled the current. And as long as that's okay for the inverter, then that might be a way to get around that.
It would be.
Issue.
That's a solar expert giving us some lessons right there. So good way to
Straight facts.
It's like extending the way you're connecting into the inverter onto the roof, isn't it?
Yeah.
So save drawing that string up, as long as your cables are the right size to carry that voltage and current. That's probably a good workaround, isn't it? Rather than trying to get up through someone's house again, maybe another conduit run or another
if your
PV
inverter-
ultra length.
Yeah, or if your inverter just hasn't got the inputs, it might be that it hasn't got the input for another system, and so you have to do that on the roof side. And that was a perfect segue there, Mark, into what we have to look at with the cabling. So in that situation, you'll be hoping and praying you've used 6 mil probably, because you've just doubled the current that the system needs. And so if I read this little bit here about overload on the DC side, so back over to regulation corner. So this section 712.433, just to make myself sound even better, protection against overload on the DC side. So same regulation number, but point 1, overload protection may be omitted to the PV string and PV array cables when the continuous current carrying capacity of the cable is equal to or greater than 1.25 times ISC, standard test conditions at any location. So if we drill into that a little bit, it's basically saying that we don't need to fit any fuses or anything like that, as long as the cable is equal to or greater than 1.25 times that short circuit current for that standard test conditions for that string. But the interesting bit here, and one that has dawned on me a little bit, is at any location, right? So you've used 6 mil. I'm looking at these trainers now, and these trainers have a cable of 4 mil.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the thing. We can design in any string cabling we like, but the panels come with what they come with, and you're going to still put that current through.
Yeah. Do your DMEGs say anything on that, Mark?
DMEGs. Yeah, 4 mil.
4 mil.
4 mil cables.
Cheap, aren't they? That's the cheap. These manufacturers would prefer to save a bit of money, but that's.
I wonder if Optimizer's been. Mind you, I guess and I think the Tigo Teague Optimizers have 4 mil tails on them as well. So you
can't remember what the Solar Edge ones have on. But it's interesting that you can think you've been all clever, and then suddenly it isn't, because your panels have got 4 mil. Yeah. So that raises the question: if all panels have 4 mil, why are we using 6 mil?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to help a bit with volt drop, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the rest, in terms of maybe avoiding a fuse when you otherwise wouldn't have to, I don't think it's going to help in that regard.
Yeah.
The 1.25 times. I think on most domestic systems, even at 4 mil, the use of fuses is probably going to be few and far between.
Yeah.
So it can carry a good old beefy current. I've defaulted to just using 6 mil as standards after a conversation with Dan from DMH. Because I'd seen he'd started doing that, and I didn't want him to be the only one who was too cool for school. So we started to do the same as standard anyway. But I mean, sizes go beyond 6 mil, don't they? You'd venture into the world of your commercial systems, you can be up 10 mil bigger sometimes.
Yeah, well, the reason that it's interesting to me is I think we used, I think we could have got away with 10 mil, but we had to use 16 mil because basically you just couldn't buy 10 mil PV cable. The only one we could buy was 16 mil, so we had to bite the bullet and do that. And it was Solar Edge, so again, it's a bit of an outlier, and we'll probably go into it a bit more detail on a separate podcast, but we were doing that purely for the volt drop element of it. The one thing, whilst we're on about the string fusing and what have you, is I'm just refreshing myself here, because it's not that common, certainly in domestic, but if you have a system with more than 2 strings paralleled up, I'm trying to find the exact bit in here. I believe that is when you need to venture into the string fusing element, because
it would be.
You got 15 amps, 15 amps, 15 amps. You're not going to get that level of protection, the 1.25 protection above on your cabling. And
not your 4mm tails on your panels,
No.
So that is when the fusing does come into its
That's
own.
it. Yeah. So I'm trying to find the exact bit. I think it's this regulation here, but there's too many numbers and that flying at me whilst
Regulation corner's blinded itself already.
I need
you've done
to
a
be...
sterling job over there reading.
Come back to me. Cut.
It's like, no, you've made a really good point with that 1.25 times and the fusing, and you'll see that. I've been to, I can't remember who it was now, but I went to a solar array just doing some testing, and they'd got a load of string fuses. I mean, typically on these big field arrays, they're in cabinets out at the end of the row of panels, aren't they, where they fuse
combiner
them.
boxes.
Yeah,
and
combiner
like
boxes and fuse them. And I think with the what's it called now, the ProJoy DC isolation switch we used on a domestic system, I think the first one we got, that came with fuses in it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using string fuses, just because your system maybe can get away without it, because your cables can carry 1.25 times the rated current. But it is another point that a consumer's maybe going to have something go wrong. It's the other chain of thought, and those been up in the loft, maybe in a combiner box, isn't the easiest place for them to get to. So if your cables can carry that short circuit current, they're not going to set on fire, are they? And the problem will be detected by the inverter. I think they're looking for all those things. Your optimizers, certainly. So the risk on modern systems, I think, is much reduced to what it was maybe 10 years ago, where you didn't have optimizers, where the inverters weren't looking for arcs and doing insulation resistance tests. It just wasn't happening, was it? So you had to factor that in with some fuse protection.
I suppose one thing here as a bit of a workaround for anyone panicking, listening to this and thinking, oh my God, I didn't know anything about the 1.25 times and everything, is the majority of the times is that you're going to be fine. Even if you don't do this calculation, you're probably going to be fine just by luck. But for those times where it does require, a lot more thought, and you've maybe dropped a clanger with not putting the right cabling in, then like you've just said, Mark, there's no reason why, if you can't achieve that 1.25 times the short circuit current, there's no reason why you can't just put some string fuses in.
No, not at all.
The reason that 1.25 times is there is so that in the event of a short circuit on those panels, your cable doesn't burst into flames like you've mentioned, and your isolator doesn't blow off the wall. But if you have some string fusing in, then that is going to be what takes the brunt of that, like we see on the AC side of things as well. So there are workarounds there that if you do come across that problem, I'm just trying to think of an example. Like say a lot of panels got damaged on a solar farm or a big installation, and the only panels you could get without having to change, it's all been wired in 4mm. A lot of panels get damaged, all on one string. You're going to have to put some new panels on that have a higher short circuit current, and therefore that calculation doesn't make sense. You could either pay to replace all the cabling to 6mm, or you could potentially put some string fuses in to protect that 4mm cable in the event of a short circuit. Because you have to remember, this is for the short circuit. This isn't for just standard working conditions. Because if we bring that back to this document here, yes, the ampage doesn't change that much. If you had a string of these Trinas, we've got 10.64 amps of short circuit, and it drops to 9.99 during its maximum power point. So it's maximum power point. So again, that's only if it's hitting 435 watts on the panel. So it's not something to massively panic over, but this does need consideration. And I think looking at what the old inverters can do and what old panel data is, the open circuit voltage. I remember fitting a lot of panels back in the day, and most of them were sort of like 31 volts open circuit voltage. And the current, I can't quite remember the current as much But if you're having to replace some of those through maintenance or through damage or whatever, then you're probably fitting something like these panels here, which this one here is 51.8 volts open circuit voltage, and the ampage is probably higher as well. So it's you can't just smash a lot of panels on without taking this into consideration. And it's, to be honest, this conversation has reignited this in me as well, because I think you do drop into a bit of complacency.
You do, using the tools online that can do all this for you, and Solar Edge sounds like a really easy system to work with. I think you've made a really good point there. We're all looking at this through fresh eyes of systems we're installing, but we've got this massive bubble of installs that went in sort of 10 or 15 years ago, which are going to start to reach their end of their lifetime and need replacement. And maybe the core wiring around that install is suitable to reuse. But the panels that we're putting onto that might dictate consideration of changing the isolator sizes, changing the fuse arrangement if there is one or isn't. So it's something to think about from that point of view as well. We're reworking to the best value for stuff that's already there, rather than just rip the whole lot out and start again. There may be a saving for the customer there that they can make without having to do that. And I think that's where careful design comes into its own for all of these systems. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that, I don't want to go on another rant after some of the other chats we've had recently, but that's been taken out of industry by a lot of the energy retailers who are just quoting these prices and going in and sticking whatever systems in. A lot of this design's gone. It's nothing really aimed at delivering what's best for the customer and electrically most efficient. Going back to Damon's point, energy retailers wanting people to consume energy or sell energy through them. Are they setting things up in the best interests of customers, or are independent small installers doing that? I've said this a few times on social media this week. I'll stop the rant in a second, that a lot of these independents will be gone in 2 or 3 years if something isn't done about that.
And a lot of skill goes with those smaller companies as well, because and this isn't a rant to the company that, this is a rant to even big solar companies that are just box fitting, and they've got complacent that it always seems to work. But then they get caught out on a factory that has 200 of these trainers, and they've always just been around 45 volts open circuit. And then suddenly these are 51.8, and there's a massive problem. And if you have a lot of panels like that, firstly, what do you do with all those panels that you now have to take off? You're going to have to stump the cost of buying new panels. So I think complacency in all areas of electrical design is kind of almost your worst enemy. But if a lot of the smaller companies like ourselves that care about all this stuff, hence doing this podcast about it, we care about it so much, that if companies like ourselves got a business and it's left to big corporates to do it, yes, there's lots of tools that can help, but it's been able to understand what you see in these books, in the guidance, and have that knowledge. And ultimately, we're not stacking shelves. We are professionals that have gone through lots of qualifications, lots of experience, and to lose that is so soul destroying, because running a business is hard, but doing all this stuff is technical as well as hard. And if you move away from that point where you have technical people in the company and you just look to just box move and box shift and just sell as much as you can without taking into account all of the design and respecting people that can do all of this and pushing more people to do this, like apprentices, like what you do a lot of work with, Mark. This is what you get paid for as a professional. You don't get paid to, drop a panel on some rails and do up the end clamps. What you do, but the big money is in the design, is the knowledge behind all of that to allow you to put that panel on the roof. Like all this has to come first. You can't just be fitting the panel on the roof.
Yeah, I mean, it's the buzzword of government is roll out and getting this stuff done as quickly as possible and meeting demand, mass rollout of all this stuff. And that can't be achieved while maintaining the quality, because the pool of people out doing this stuff isn't large enough. So they're kind of turning a blind eye on all of that. And I think they're letting the wheels off for a lot of these energy companies to just run with the heat pumps and solar stuff, because they're so desperate to hit the net zero targets. And it's not in the best interest of customers. It's certainly not in the best interest of the skilled people out. The art of being an electrician is in design and installation. That's where the skill is. So taking somebody's home apart to avoid using a consumer unit that's outside, to make sure that your cables are capable of withstanding the fault currents and that your panels are feeding into an inverter to get those extra 200 units of generation every year. That is the art of being an electrician, and you do not get that rolling at volume to try and meet net zero in the way that it's happening right now.
Yeah, I think we're almost our own worst enemy in things, and I don't want to get this political, but it's one of those things where we expect results very, very quickly, and the reality is, you spend years training to be an electrician, to be a plumbing and heating engineer, to then do specialisms in low temperature heat pumps and in solar, and it takes years to build all this up. But in the political world, they've got 4 or 5 years to basically make a result. 4 years is like when I did my apprenticeship, it was the standard apprenticeship. That's like you've only just got someone through to be a professional. So if you want to roll something out and you want youngsters to do it, you're not going to see the results of that until the end of your term in government. Mm-hmm. And Labour are saying it's going to take 10 years to repair the NHS, but that's 10 years is probably the minimum to make any big change. 10 years, someone's come out of their apprenticeship after year 4, they've then been working for 4 or 5 years. They're at their peak at that point. That is when those electricians, those plumbing and heating engineers are looking at, right, I've got all this experience, I've done all my certificates, I'm ready to go. What shall I go into? And if you roll something out, you need to let them have the time to get all of that basic stuff done, all of this bit that we've been talking about today, understand all of this, have some experience doing it, and then they can scale up, do more work, train more people. You can't turn that around in 2 years. It's just impossible.
It's impossible. It's not going to happen, is it? I think, that the conversations that are happening now is a lot of the manufacturers and energy retailers saying to government, the industry of things, electrical and plumbing, have had a long time to get this sorted, to solve the skills crisis, to meet this demand, and they've not done it. We can do it. We'll deliver for you. We'll ramp up, give us investment, support us. We'll do all of this stuff. And they're promising delivery, and they've got to hit the targets, and that's what we're seeing. I think now we need the industry of things in the plumbing and the electrical world to stand with contractors and push back against that a bit and explain the difficulties in achieving the skills that are needed with the funding that's put into apprenticeships. It's not enough. And also, the quality aspect and serving consumers best, and that's something that needs to happen and isn't. But before we end on a total rant, I want to pull back to the design side and just speak a little bit about the solar edge stuff, because that's something that I've just been thinking about in terms of the VOC and the ISC and stuff. When we're talking about panels and our isolators and things, are we still using the data on the panels with a solar edge system and its optimizers, or are we using the voltage that's flowing around the string back to the inverter and the currents?
Yeah, so basically the optimizer is really what you're linking your panel to. So SolarEdge have a fantastic design tool that allows you to design the panels on the roof, set the layout and everything like that. But it also then gives you the recommendation as to what optimizer to use. So, for example, S440s have been, for us, the most common one we've used. There's loads of different ones, S500s, S500Bs, P850s. There's loads of stuff. So, for example, the S440s, as a rule, you can pretty much put like a 440 watt panel onto that S440 optimizer. There's then limits to the amount of optimizers that you can put on that string. The design tool is the best way to work that out because it depends on your orientation, your pitch, if you're putting panels over different orientations. So you might have an east-west system on one string, which is like mind-blowing to people that just do standard string inverters, because that's like breaking rule 1 of solar. But you then have other situations with SolarEdge, like for the P1000s or the S1000s, I can't remember. It's just basically generation, like the generation of optimizer. But the P850s, there's an option there to parallel those panels up into that one optimizer. So effectively, you have one optimizer working with 2 panels. So it doesn't give you the panel by panel data. It would give you the dual panel data for that. So you'd only get, you'd see double the ampage coming from that bank of panels, but the same.
I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? On a large array when you can kind of be pointed at a fault close enough to figure out what's going on, but still get all the benefits of an optimizer across them, save some money.
A DC safe, and that's it. If you've got 1,000 panels, you can either fit 1,000 optimizers or you can fit 500. And if they're 50 quid an optimizer cost, you are saving a hell of a lot of money there, and you don't jeopardize anything on the safety because they're still DC safe. Those optimizers will shut down if there's a problem, only delivering 1 volt down to the inverter. And you have things like solar sense, I think it's called. I can never remember what it is, but that's basically looking at resistance values from the optimizer to your panels, and the other way from memory, looking at if you have a high resistance joint so that it shuts down that panel if it senses a high resistance joint, so you don't get these fires that you see on these systems sometimes through poor termination of an MC4 or one that's not clicked in correctly. So for me, and I want to save a lot of this for a Solar Edge one, really, if you'll indulge me in that. But for me, Solar Edge is where we are going, but we aren't there yet because the market is eating itself through cost at the minute, and it's so difficult to sell a Solar Edge solar PV system at the minute because it's just more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, we had a conversation over WhatsApp about a proposal I'd put in this week, and I was told it was too expensive, and I worked out, I think it was about £1,000 in the job for 2 people over a week's long worth of work. It's like, what on earth is going on out there? I feel quite lucky that we're insulated from that because of the YouTube side of things and other electrical work, but I do feel that frustration among installers who aren't lucky enough to have that, who are doing this day to day and week to week in EV and PV, and they've just been absolutely destroyed. And I'm gutted for them. I intend to keep shouting about it in the hope that something can be done. I'm sure my voice will make little difference, but I'm still going to make a fuss where I can and try and help rectify that problem. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, it is. But we've gone on such a rant there again.
I know.
We don't want to be a ranting podcast.
Before we end, I just want to say I've really learnt a lot from Sam. I love these conversations. Sam's one of the experts out in solar and has been for a long, long time. We are going to have conversations with TIS, who are going to come in and speak specifically about testing. I know Give Energy want to come and talk to us, and maybe we can get Solar Edge on as well, who could come and have a sit-down chat with us about all of these things. It's really, really interesting. I love electrical design. But as you say, I think we've gone on quite long enough. So if you want to lead us out on this one, unless you've got anything else you want to add before we disappear?
No, just that I've, revisiting some of this stuff is really interesting. And there's sometimes, myself included, can be a bit scared of looking back through these and kind of going, look, I can't remember anything. But it's surprising how much comes back when you start looking at this stuff. So it's an important touch point that if you are in this industry or different industries, just refresh yourself on some of this stuff and don't be scared to ask people as well. I get people that ask me stuff and I have to go back through the book and go, yeah, I'll tell you that in a minute. And there's no harm in doing that and refreshing yourself. Don't try and be an expert in something just because you want the notoriety of it. Look at stuff and educate yourself in it. And there's so much in solar, like we've just touched on, there's so much more in this this section of the regs around solar PV that we haven't even touched on, and that we'll probably do subsequent podcasts on. But there's a lot of design that goes into these online design tools, and I think it's important to keep your finger on being able to do this without those design tools for that job a year where it just doesn't work to put it through the design tool, and be able to pull this book out and go, right, we'll do it the old-fashioned way and go through this book. But don't be scared to look back in this book. You don't have to know this off by heart, because I didn't, and that's why I've been studying this. and I've been doing it 15 years.
Hit Stuart Cato up in the DMs just as my final comment.
Yeah, exactly, one of the OGs. So, I'm a bit fried by looking at all this now, but it's been a really good one. I've really enjoyed it, Mark. So thanks for bringing all that stuff in and providing the data sheets. But hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. A bit more of a technical one, which has been nice to stretch the old grey matter in this. But thanks very much for watching. If you do like this episode, or even if you don't, then please hit a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Leave a comment, leave questions, and if there's anyone you want us to interview, then let us know. But thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.
Bye.